So, consequences of deep coal mining. We've seen the sort of impacts on the landscape. Well, what you end up with is desiccation, lowered water tables, then substance because you've removed the overburden to get at the coal. You've removed the coal itself, but the big thing that causes substance is actually the other stuff that comes out with it. And of course, that has an impact on the wider landscape of dereliction and pollution, vast slag heaps, and other despoiled areas. What you also get is employment and then catastrophic unemployment. And along with the economic collapse, you get health issues. Huge matters of post-industrial health and health issues related to socioeconomic deprivation. And these are long lasting in those communities. There's the River Dearne. It is actually black. It's not just an artifact of the picture. The water there is black. You can see the sort of impact around the base of the riverbank there. Along the river, there are still pockets of biodiversity refugia hanging on in this post-industrial landscape, but the water itself and the river itself are gross. And you can see the impacts that it's had on the trees. The trees along the riverbanks are dead. So the restoration in brief, it began with the Yorkshire Naturalist Trust taking on parts of the site. Barnsley Metropolitan Borough Council led on the restoration, but along with what was now the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, largely led in many ways by Roger Mitchell, who also set up Thorpe Marsh and Potterick Carr. And he moved in, he became chairman of the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and was very involved in looking at the restoration of this despoiled, degraded landscape. At one point, the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust were going to take the site over, and then they decided, because they were also developing the London Wetlands Centre, they couldn't take on two really big projects at the time. The RSPB actually stepped in at short notice and very much last minute, because they had turned down the offer to get involved originally because they said it had no nationally significant species. Then when some of their officers actually stood back and looked at the wider landscape, they said, well, actually, Old Moor doesn't have national numbers, but if you take the Dearne Valley and the wider landscape of wet grasslands and valley bottom grasslands, then you have got nationally significant populations of things like lapwing and snipe, both of which are under pressure. We got involved largely through the Heritage Lottery Fund, who were supporting some of the project, and they wanted to assess their impact on economic performance. So we went in and looked at what the RSPB were doing. We gave some advice on best practice, etc., on how to rejuvenate the area, deal with the issue of capital versus revenue, which for a nature reserve and a visitor centre is a problem. And that's been incredibly successful. The despoiled land was funded by things like Derelict Land Grant, EU Coalfield Funds, and EU Objective 1 funds. So the pollution was removed, the landscape was restored or recreated, because you don't go back to what you had before, and infrastructure was put in. So the new road infrastructure went in with the Coalfields Fund, but also the things like the Transpennine Trail and the other associated routeways, cycleways, horse riding routes, footpaths, etc. And what you start to get are birds in good numbers. The Waffing Site and Broomhill Flash nearby, which is where a lot of this actually started. It's a private shooting pond near to Waffings, and this was taken over by birdwatchers and started to get huge numbers of lapwings and golden plover and the like. Wildlife spectacles and spectaculars. So this was really important and really interesting in terms of the development of the site. And the nature reserve vision was to create new extensive reed beds in this land that had until very recently now been totally despoiled. It took the remaining working farm and turned it into the officers' visitor centre and facilities, which many people will be familiar with as the core of the Old Moor Wetland Centre. So there we are. There's an extensive view of how the site looks today. it's not a floodland as it once was. It has a flood capacity and it's used in times of flood, but this doesn't replace the medieval landscape. It is a wetland, but it's a different sort of wetland. It mixes deeper water with shallower water and with ephemeral pools. But it is home for a lot of the same species that would have been there in the medieval landscape, the grass snakes and the like. And we have good numbers of roe deer coming back in to the area. And wildlife with a wow factor, because it's this huge wetland, we now get species coming in, you get attractions of large numbers of birds, and of course that brings in other birds like birds of prey, but migrating ospreys coming through and things like that. And what you've got are really nice walkways, tree carving with wildlife themes. So you've decided to generate a site which is now attractive. It's somewhere that the non-specialists might walk around and will enjoy. And it's not just the birds, it's also the chance to get eyeball to eyeball with things like dragonflies in good numbers. And these are the sort of things that will interest people and will attract people. And you're trying to bring in the specialist bird watchers, but you're also trying to bring in the regulars, and you're trying to bring in the wider public. And you hope that not only will that benefit the nature reserve through the visitor spend, but you're hoping that there's an educational aspect of this as well. So here we have an egg-laying southern hawker. So particularly interesting here is the potential of tourism to support and trigger local economic recovery. This was a very down at heel landscape. It was Objective 1, which is the poorest part of Western Europe. So even in a poor area, this was about the bottom of the Objective 1 zone in South Yorkshire. Asken was also very bad, but Wath was really very, very down at heel. And it's triggered a recovery of visitor numbers. We've now got a tourism economy based around about 100,000 day visits a year. A shop where people meet and greet, selling specialist equipment, selling bird food, selling books, etc., bringing income in. And this was what the Heritage Lottery Fund investment went in towards, things like that. And the cafe and the restaurant, this is where people can come, and they'll come here and they will come for Sunday lunch and look at the birds, not necessarily even going into the bird reserve. That doesn't matter because they're coming here, they're part of it, they're spending money, they're making the whole operation viable. So we now have 100,000 visitors per year. There's a supporting service industry that has grown up, and it's spun out hotels, restaurants, cafes and shops. And when we did the initial audits, when the site was being established, there weren't any. And now there's quite a rich network of supply chains, etc., etc. The area was briefly a nature improvement area, and it's shown there just to give some idea of the travel times to get into it, linked to local townships. So accessibility is important if you're going to get visitor spend. And it's then looking at the catchment and looking at deprivation scores of postal district. We can actually drill down in great detail to the individual wards. We can drill down even with the census data to a street level. It gets so much data at one point that you can't really analyze it. But we can actually see where you need to target your resources. So these red areas are really the areas that are struggling. And you can map out the components of the landscape. So Old Moor, but also the surrounding areas, and then right the way through up towards Grindthorpe itself, Edderthorpe Ings. So it's not just the core site, but it's a much wider area. And it was this wider area of recovering post-industrial landscape that really attracted the attention of the RSPB. And it really is a very unique site and a unique experience for the RSPB. And the Green Heart project, again, to try and get the green infrastructure embedded in the local communities, because some of these areas like Goldthorpe and Thurnscoe and Darfield and Bolton still have high levels of socioeconomic deprivation. So you're trying to make an impact on that. And the Green Heart project was designed to almost outreach the nature reserve into the community. There's still a lot to be done. We haven't cracked it yet. And obviously from a membership organisation, they're interested in what impact are they having in terms of growing their membership in that area and around the nature reserve. So that's an important issue. We're looking at habitat that brings in attractions. We talked about this before, things like starling murmurations to reed beds. Kingfishers, absolutely fantastic chance to see birds close to in good facilities. And this is something that really does get visitors very, very excited to see wildlife and nature close up. And rarities like Mediterranean gull actually breeding on the site. This is big news. It brings in the specialist bird watchers as well as the local people. Black terns regularly. Terns coming in and breeding, common terns breeding, and also things like the tree sparrows, which were a great attraction at the Broomhill Flash site and carried on. I've been told that they've now reduced in number, which will be sad, because this is a once common bird that is now nationally under threat. And of course, along the river and in the nature reserve, sand martins. Again, you get the birds breeding, but you also get spectacular experiences of large numbers of the birds migrating. And herons, the rivers and the wetlands are now much, much cleaner. They're teeming with fish. The RSPB has reintroduced eels to the area. So now the herons are coming back and you're getting a really exciting chance to see these breeding locally, feeding locally, roosting locally. And things like avocets, which was once an iconic rarity, we now have back on our doorstep. And people will come to see these. And of course, the bitterns booming, really amazing, because this was a bird that was commonplace across the Humber levels and down the arterial rivers like Dearne Valley, and they were extinct for so long, but now they're back, and that really is amazing. It's fantastic. And if you've got the large numbers of small birds and large numbers of dragonflies, you'll get things like hobbies coming through to migrate through and to hunt. And one of the things that they're after are the big dragonflies. The dragonflies themselves are a spectacular attraction for local people. So I think Dearne Valley shows us what can be done, what can be achieved with imagination, with long-term planning, and with boldness, but boldness underpinned by an understanding of the reality, the socio-economic reality, and that is still to be fully resolved. Some of the communities are still not engaged and they still suffer major economic deprivation. But one of the things of the project is to actually increase the educational benefit of the area and to engage those communities in the long term. So there are economic issues, there are environmental issues like biodiversity, landscape, quality, and the need to bring people from these peripheral communities into engaging along the walkways, the cycleways, the routeways, and into the nature reserve itself. So everybody gets benefit, and we as society get benefit, because all these good things that happen make people healthier, happier, fitter, and that actually also saves money, which is important in the long term as well. So, LinkedIn thought from Waffing Site. Thank you very much.